last speaker of the session is Umair Hamid. His title is The Scandalous in West, Religion, Nation and Historiography.
Hello, good morning everyone. So the title of my paper is The Scandalous Embrace, Religion, Nation and Historiography. So particularly I'm looking at the historical works written around from 1940 to 1980s on Kashmir, particularly the author of Aquil Bamzai. So I'm looking at his history writing on Kashmir, and particularly his ideas, how they intertwine with religion, nation in the process of history writing. I'm going to look at it particularly through two ways. One, the idea, the presence of the secular in his writing, and the relocation of the religion within this secular history writing. Before that, I'm also going to talk a bit about the Aryan, which the notion of the Aryan, the racial presence, which was very much linked to the colonial colonial history writing project, and he seems to have made that very much prominent in his writing, especially the initial period of Kashmir, particularly till the setup of the Islamic, as it were, the Muslim rule. So particularly the first phase from the advent of which he distinguishes as the Hindu period in Kashmir history, is something which is very much linked to the idea of the Aryan. So the Aryan is coming from there. So I can go back a bit and talk about the relation between Aryan and the Enlightenment, and how it was. It became a very much very much recurrent trope in the Enlightenment thinkers, and was reproduced by the colonial officials and ideologists in order to account for their the questions of origin and other kind of things. So I'll talk a bit about Enlightenment, and then I'll go about the kind of the creation myth, where it becomes more prominent in Bamzai's narrative, and then I will talk a bit about the need of the nation in order to write history, to find a kind of particular territoriality, the fixity to the past. In any sense, the idea that there's something which becomes foreign with the coming of the Muslim rule, or what he calls as the Muslim rule. The idea that there's something called as fixed, and that kind of an identity is portrayed onto the past, is very much central to Bamzai's account of history, and I'll look a bit on that as well. So and the kind of a relocation and the kind of necessary relation it has with the idea of a nation, because he's writing at a very crucial point. He's writing particularly this particular work, which is history and culture, the culture and politics, the cultural and religion of Kashmir, which came out in 1962, the first version, and the second edited version came out in 1972. And he was really part of before that. So Bamzai, he was a part of this Ministry of Publication, Information and Publication Broadcasting, and he started to write this history because Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah, around 1954, he asked him to write about it, and he made the kind of an archive very much accessible to him. So he starts writing around that and produces this work around 1962, which was a foreword was written by Jawaharlal Nehru to it, and the foreword sets up the kind of the tone of the work, where he mentions that this work of this historian, it's Bamzai, it makes clear the kind of it makes clear that the Kashmir, this kind of an exceptionalism of Kashmir is brought out in the very foreword, where he says that this was the land where we see which became a kind of a melting pot of different cultures, and it was because of this kind of a past that it has that it becomes crucial for 1947, that it was a natural corollary and natural a kind of trajectory that it was to kind of made accession. It was to kind of make that accession with India on the kind of that affinity of the secular, which is kind of imposed onto the past. Now, before I go on to that, I'll just start with what I talked about, the Enlightenment and the Aryan, which is very much seen in the works of particularly Voltaire around 18th century, 17th, 18th centuries. Voltaire writes about it, and he kind of writes about it not simply as the Aryan does not simply figure there as an authentic race, but it's somehow imbricated within his larger project of, because he's involved at the same time with the critique of the church and organized religion. So he kind of thinks about this, the category of the Aryan, in terms of, for example, universal reason and authentic religion, somehow which was distinctive from something like an organized religion. So at the same time, even in this Enlightenment and the Aryan, the relation between Enlightenment and the Aryan is the idea that these Enlightenment philosophers, at the same time, what they are trying to do is there's a subtle kind of relocation or repositioning of religion in terms of the kind of a particular, which was later to kind of settle down into this kind of a binary of private and the public. And religion becoming as a set of a belief, something which is more cognitive and not to do with praxis a lot. So let's start with that. In this Enlightenment project, the Asia as kind of, it was portrayed with this certain kind of paradox. At the same time, it created a space which was the domain of reason and virtue, because of the authenticity of the Aryan and the location of the Aryan in it. And at the same time, it was degenerate. So it becomes important for the colonial officials to kind of think about the Aryan not simply as something that, because the origin is located in somewhere in India. Now, they don't simply stipulate that because of the fact that we have authentic Aryans, so the authentic past is in India, so we must imitate it. But at the same time, they say that no, with the time it has degenerated. So the kind of the idea that Aryan was not simply used as it was strategic tool which is used in a way to at the same time authenticate what was the past, and at the same time to negate the condition of the present, which was depicted as being degenerate. Now, Voltaire, what Voltaire maintained, that the Brahmin religion was even more ancient because he had this fascination with China. So, because of the fact that he couldn't read the script properly, so he said, in the Brahmin religion, we have something which is more ancient than China, and the Chinese, and other nations like the Egyptians and others, they had come to the Indians to learn what is authentic. Now, he simply doesn't do that with the idea that, so here he mentions exclusively the kind of the term, says that unlike the Saracens, Tatars, Arabs and the Jews who lived by piracy, the Aryans found nourishment in a religion that was based upon universal religion. Now here we find the first traces of something where the relocation is happening. And at the same time, what he's talking about is that this kind of authenticity, which was somewhere in the past, it was made because he kind of subscribed to this Montesquieu's theory, which was that climate had to do and geography had a lot to do with the kind of political systems you have, the kind of. So he says that the climate has what the climate did was that it had brought in these modern superstitions in the Indian religion, and hence the kind of the present of the Asia was not exemplary in that sense. So one had to go back to that past, and for that the textual kind of a link was missing. So there was a kind of a text, a peculiar kind of text was produced around late 18th century. So kind of Voltaire kind of published it. It was it came out around 1782 or 1782. It was called the Azor-Vedam. Now he said that this kind of text was par excellence, it was authentic par excellence, and it became this kind of an old text, something. So he doesn't really equate that with the Vedas. He says that it goes before Vedas. The Vedas became corrupt at a later point of time, but this one is something which has this kind of an authenticity to it. He says, this Veda announced a pure cult, disengaged from all superstition and all fanaticism. Written by the first Brahmins, who also served as kings and pontiffs, it established a religion based upon universal reason. Now, of course, it came to be later that this was not an actual work, but was written by someone in France, and it was translated into French. It was by the name of Saint Croix, the guy who was with the name of Saint Croix, who kind of wrote it down. And at the same time, what Voltaire talks about was this loss of rational religion, which happened because of this kind of lack with the kind of authentic past. Now, he says a considerable portion of this early discourse, surrounding Veda was to mourn this loss of rational religion that has suffered corruption, and blaming the Brahmin elite. So he blamed the Brahmin elite for it, because they neither instructed the people properly nor desired knowledge themselves. As I mentioned, it was part of Voltaire's repository, where he was involved in this kind of a constant challenge of the organized religion, and his more inclination towards the Protestant kind of religious experience. So the kind of the substance of the text which I mentioned, the Raziuddin, it's a kind of a dialogue between two. It's a dialogue between a Brahmin and a philosopher. Now here also we see that a kind of authorial shift is happening, because the Brahmin, when a Brahmin priest, he talks about this superstitions and all, the kind of the philosopher, the kind of the other person who is in dialogue with Brahman, he kind of starts giving reasonable answers to those superstitions and defending the position of the reason, and of course it fits well into his other kind of agenda that he had, which was his constant rejection of the Jewish people as being the chosen one. That's something I won't touch upon here. It was followed by in the case of Indian context, by William Jones. So William Jones talked about the Aryan myth very much, because he was very much part of this whole repertoire. So he depicted the ancient Aryan in terms which was not dissimilar from, for example, Voltaire and others who were doing at that point of time. He says that they were a spirit people, and all that was considered valuable in the ancients found an initial expression among the Aryans. And of course, as I said, that there's a constant rejection of the present. The present is supposed to be degenerate. It's not something which can be, and it also justifies this colonial sort of a mission where this kind of the presence in the present was something which was to kind of given this kind of a new light to it. Jones writes today regarding the Aryans and the kind of its link with the present. Says, today they appear degenerate and abased. In some early age they were splendid in arts and arms, happy in government, wise in legislation, and eminent in various knowledge. And he, for Jones, because he was involved in it, he wrote the kind of, for Jones, the Veda and the Upanishads, they became the textual archive from which we could really talk about the Aryans. So these kind of textual, this kind of literary output which was there, he thought that this was very much part of knowing about the Aryans. Before the Aryans disappeared, however, they left a textual trace of their genius behind in the Veda and its compendium, the Upanishads. These texts provided source material for information regarding the Aryans and their noble metaphysics. Now, of course, these were also reproduced by others like Kolbrook, and most importantly, it was done by Max Muller. For Max Muller, this was not simply an attempt at knowing about the past, but it was also an attempt to know about the authentic tradition of Europe itself. For example, he writes, I wish that Veda and its religion and philosophy should not only seem to you curious or strange, but that you should feel that there was in them something that concerns ourselves, something of our own intellectual growth, some recollections, as it were, of our own childhood, or at least the childhood of our own race. He goes further and he says that the Aryans were the true ancestors of our race, and the Veda is the oldest book we have in which to study the first beginnings of our language. And for and of all that is embodied in language. And he connects it with the idea of the Aryan nations and Aryan humanity, which becomes central to Miller's experience of writing about the Vedas and the Aryans. There was another kind of suggestion that was made by Max Muller and others with this kind of suggestion, was that the Europeans are in a better condition to understand the Aryans more than the indigenous Indians can do, because they have degenerated, and we can go back to it by taking recourse to language, another kind of, because he did it essentially with language. Muller later on did it with language, and we can really reach the core of it and talk about it. There's this very long passage, so I'd like to quote it, where Muller talks about Aryan and the Vedas. So I'll start from half of it. I will quote the full passage. He says, and if we were to ask if I were to ask myself from what literature we here in Europe, who have been nurtured almost exclusively on the thoughts of Greeks and Romans and on Semitic race, the Jewish may draw that corrective which is most wanted in order to make our inner life more perfect, more comprehensive, more universal, in fact more truly human, a life not for this life only, but transfigured and eternal life. Again, I should point to India. I am thinking chiefly of India, such as it was 1,000, 2,000, it may be 3,000 years ago, not of towns today, but village communities. Okay, I'll skip this part of it. Particularly this, for example, when Max Muller talks about the Aryan religion, he says there is no trace in the Veda of the atrocities of Shiva and Kali, nor the licentiousness of Krishna, nor of most of the miraculous adventures of Vishnu. We find in it no law to sanction the blasphemous pretensions of a priesthood to divine honors, or the degradation of any human being to a state below the animal. There is no text to continence laws which allow the marriage of children and prohibit the marriage of child widows. Here, there are other kind of two themes which kind of crop up again and again. One is this idea that in this authentic kind of a past, there's no blood sacrifice. So this kind of horror on something which is on the idea of sacrifice is something which is really part of all these kind of Enlightenment thinkers who are thinking about it. And at the same time, there's this particular mention time and again of this kind of inner life. So something, this religious experience has something to do with this inner part of our being, which was really part of this Enlightenment shift from this public presence of religion to something more cognitive and more belief oriented. Now, how is Bamzai related to this notion of the Aryan? Because in his narration of events, this idea of the Aryan takes very much prominent position in the mention of this creation myth, which he goes on to talk about in detail. And he says that, for example, he talks about, and in this very early part of the work, which is really an introductory part of the work, he says belonging to regarding the people of Jammu, the people who reside in Jammu, he says, belonging to the Aryan race, they speak in Dogri language, a mixture of the Sanskrit, Punjabi and Persian words, deriving its origins from Indo-Aryan branch of the Sanskrit, of course. So his work is more sort of oriented very rigorously around the idea of this racial biology. So he kind of, whether it has to do with the traits of the particular kind of people, the hill people, so the kind of this colonial sort of ethnography comes in very rigorously. So he talks about these high cheekbones and this particular kind of height, this particular kind of guide is something that has to do with martial character and so on and so forth. While talking about it, what he mentions in the creation myth is that there was this very much well-known myth that Kashmir or the valley itself was a lake, and then it was inhabited by a demon, which made it impossible for people to inhabit this place. And he goes on to say that there was this sage named Kashyapa, and he, with the help of Shiva and others, helped to kill the devil, the evil creature that was in the water, because it was supposed to be a lake. and he drained the water out of it and made it habitable for people. Now he says that there were Aryans who came from Central Asia. They kind of lived there and they drew out the Pisachas, and in that they kind of with the Nagas. So the Nagas and the Pisachas were not on good footing, and they had to be drawn out. So Aryans, they drew them out with the help of Aryans, and the people started to leave that place. What's important here is that which he goes on to mention later is this figment of which he talks about in terms of even art, that the kind of art referring to Cunningham and others, that the kind of art that we find at least in the Hindu period was something which one could call as the Aryan architecture. That's all. Okay. So I took a lot of time on the Enlightenment and all, but what's important in Bamzai's historical narration is this: the need to situate the nation in a certain kind of fixity allows to him to think about the Muslim, which he differentiates as the Muslim period, as being the foreigners. Now the idea of the foreigners is something which is which in a way talks about not simply the kind of already marked area, sort of. Now the idea is that once a nation has this kind of inhabited boundary, it can really talk about its sedentariness and its belonging in a certain way. Now they become foreigners simply because of the fact that they came from outside, and which is because of the fact that if one talks about this, that David Luton talks about this, that pre-modern cultures or pre-modern life was not that much governed by sedentariness, but there was a certain kind of movement to it. For example, Kashmir became a certain kind, which is usually referred as now a borderland, that it was at a place where which didn't have these particular fixed rigidities. So it was on a borderland where there were passages people came from and people went away out of it. Now, what I wanted to emphasize here was that this reallocation of religion becomes part of this broader narrative where he talks about this idea of tolerance. There's still time. Okay. So he talks about the categories of tolerance and coexistence become very.
Just sharing that if you can summarize in 2 minutes.
Okay. So what becomes important in his historical narration is this the kind of syncretic past. So he talks about that the tolerance, but not tolerance in general, but a particular kind of tolerance where, for example, sharing in different festivals becomes the hallmark of someone who could be talked about as tolerant, liberal outlook. So yeah, that's it.